Ambassador Idris Okonkwo sat in his chair at the far end of the galactic concordance chamber and watched the elder species talk over each other like he was not even there. The chamber itself was enormous, a dome of living crystal that floated above the capital world of the concordance, and inside it sat representatives from over 4,000 civilizations that had spread across the galaxy over the last 200,000 years. Idris was the only human in the room. He had been the only human in the room for the last 11 years, ever since Earth had been granted what the concordance politely called an observer seat, and what Idris privately called a decorated insult. He raised his hand to speak, and the moderator, a tall and thin creature from the Velasi species with 6 eyes that blinked in sequence, looked right through him and called on the next speaker. Idris lowered his hand. This was the 14th time this session. Back on Earth, in a reinforced command bunker buried beneath the frozen surface of Luna, Admiral Vasanta Rao stood before a wall of tactical displays and watched her fleet run another drill. 300 warships moved through the dark between Mars and Jupiter, executing combat formations that no galactic species had used in over 100,000 years, because no galactic species had needed to fight a real war in that long. The concordance kept peace through hierarchy, and through the unspoken understanding that the elder species at the top of that hierarchy could crush anyone beneath them without effort. Humanity sat at the very bottom. Rao crossed her arms and studied the formations on the screen and said nothing for a long time. Her aide, Captain Deshi Yebo, walked up beside her and held out a tablet. "The concordance monitoring station near Saturn flagged our drill again," he said. "What did they say this time?" Rao asked without looking away from the display. "They called it, and I am quoting directly here, charmingly paranoid." Rao let out a slow breath through her nose. "Good," she said, "let them think that." 6,000 light-years away from Earth, on a world called Cethra Prime, Warlord Cethrak of the Rethan Dominion stood on the observation deck of his flagship and looked down at a planet that had once belonged to someone else. The Corvalli had lived there for 9,000 years before the Rethan came. They had built cities of white stone and filled them with music and art, and a language so beautiful that other species traveled across the galaxy just to hear it spoken. That was before. Now the cities were burning, and the Corvalli who had not been killed were being loaded into transport ships to be taken to labor camps on the outer rim. Cethrak watched the smoke rise from the surface and felt nothing at all. He was tall even by Rethan standards, nearly 3 meters of scaled muscle and armored bone, with eyes like molten copper and a jaw that could crush stone. His species had evolved as apex predators on a high-gravity world, and they had carried that predatory nature into the stars with a religious devotion that made other species very nervous. But the concordance did nothing about the Rethan. The Corvalli were not signatories to the concordance charter, and therefore their suffering was, in the precise legal language of the concordance, outside the scope of collective concern. Cethrak had learned long ago that the galaxy did not care about the weak. It only cared about the powerful. And the Rethan were very, very powerful. His second in command, a scarred veteran named Drethak, approached from behind and bent one knee in respect. "Warlord, the fleet is assembled as you ordered, 12,000 warships ready for transit." Cethrak did not turn from the viewport. "And the target?" "A small species on the inner edge of the Orion Spur. They call themselves human. They have approximately 300 warships and a handful of colony worlds. Our intelligence division estimates full conquest in less than 1 planetary rotation." Cethrak finally turned and looked at Drethak with a thin smile that showed rows of razor teeth. "Tell me about their world." "It is a Class 12 death world. Warlord, unstable climate, tectonic activity, predatory wildlife, severe weather patterns. It is remarkable they survived it all." "And yet they did." "They are resilient, but they are small. They have no energy weapons, no shield technology, No FTL-capable warships beyond slow cargo haulers. By every measure, they are the weakest spacefaring species in the known galaxy. Seathrek turned back to the viewport and watched the last of the Corvallis cities crumble. Then they will fall quickly, he said. Open the transit corridors. We move on Sol within the hour. On Earth, it was a Tuesday. The sun was setting over the Atlantic Ocean and painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and people were going home from work and sitting down to dinner and helping their children with homework and doing all the small, ordinary things that people do when they do not know that everything is about to change. In Mumbai, a street vendor was selling chai to commuters at a railway station. In Toronto, a woman was teaching her daughter to ride a bicycle in a park. In Nairobi, an old man was sitting on his porch and listening to the evening birds. None of them knew that, at that exact moment, 12,000 alien warships had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of their solar system. The first to detect them was a deep space monitoring station on Pluto's moon Charon, a small facility staffed by 4 technicians who spent most of their shifts playing cards and complaining about the cold. Technician First Class, Maria Santos, was in the middle of winning a hand when her console lit up with more contacts than she had ever seen in her life. She stared at the screen for 3 full seconds before she whispered a word that was not appropriate for official channels and slammed her hand down on the priority alert. The alert reached Luna Command in 4 minutes. It reached Admiral Rao in 4 minutes and 6 seconds. It reached the United Nations in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. And then the Rethan broadcast began. It came on every frequency, in every language, translated with cold mechanical precision, and it said this: People of the planet Earth, this is Warlord Seathrak of the Rethan Dominion. You have 1 rotation of your world to surrender your planet, your colonies, and your species into the service of the Dominion. Your government will be dissolved. Your military will be dismantled, and your population will be assigned labor quotas in accordance with Dominion law. Compliance will be rewarded with survival. Resistance will be answered with extinction. There will be no second offer. The message played on loop. It played on television screens and radio stations and emergency broadcast systems across the planet. It played in the chai vendor's stall in Mumbai and in the park in Toronto, and on the old man's porch in Nairobi. For one long, terrible moment, the entire world held its breath. In the concordance chamber, 6,000 light-years away, Idris Okonkwo did not wait to be called on. He stood from his chair and walked to the center of the floor and spoke in a voice that was steady even though his hands were shaking. The Rethan Dominion has just threatened my homeworld with enslavement or annihilation. I am formally requesting concordance intervention under Article 7 of the Mutual Defense Provisions. The chamber was silent. The Velisi moderator blinked all 6 of its eyes one after another and said, Ambassador Okonkwo, Earth is an observer member. Article 7 applies only to full signatories with recognized fleet contributions. Your request does not meet the threshold for consideration. My world is about to be destroyed, Idris said. We understand your concern, the moderator replied. We recommend that your species negotiate terms of compliance with the Rethan Dominion. The Concordance Mediation Office can provide you with the appropriate forms. Idris stood there for a moment. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber without another word. Behind him, 4,000 civilizations went back to their agenda. And in Luna Command, Admiral Vasanta Rao read the Rethan ultimatum one more time, set the tablet down on her desk, and looked at Captain Yebo with eyes that were calm and hard, and absolutely without fear. Wake everyone up, she said, all of them everywhere right now. Admiral, Yebo said quietly, what do we tell them? Rao stood and straightened her uniform and looked up at the ceiling as if she could see straight through the rock, and the vacuum and the dark, all the way to where 12,000 warships waited for humanity to kneel. Tell them we have work to do. Warlord Seathrak stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Burning Throne, and waited for the humans to surrender. He had done this many times before with many different species, and it always went the same way. First, there was silence, as the prey species absorbed the reality of what was happening to them. Then there was panic as their leaders scrambled to find a way out that did not exist. Then there was the transmission, always trembling, always broken, always some frightened voice asking what terms the Dominion would accept. Seathrek had conquered 11 species this way. He expected the 12th to be the easiest of all. His intelligence officers had provided him with a complete profile of humanity, and by every metric that mattered, they were nothing. Their ships were slow and small, and built with physical armor instead of energy shields, which was something the galaxy had abandoned tens of thousands of years ago, because it was crude and inefficient. Their weapons fired solid projectiles and crude explosive warheads, instead of focused energy lances. Their fleet numbered barely 300 ships against his 12,000. The mathematics of this engagement were so one-sided that Seathrek had actually considered sending a smaller force, just to avoid wasting resources. But Drethak had advised bringing the full fleet anyway because the Dominion's reputation depended on overwhelming displays of power, and Seathrek had agreed because reputation was everything in a galaxy that respected only strength. So he waited, and the hours passed, and no surrender came. On Earth, the hours between the ultimatum and the deadline were the strangest hours in human history. There was fear, of course, because fear was natural, and anyone who claimed they were not afraid was either lying or broken. But something else moved through the human population in those hours, something that the Rethan and the Concordance and every other species in the galaxy would not have understood even if they had seen it with their own eyes. It was anger. Not the hot and stupid anger that makes a creature lash out without thinking. It was the cold and ancient anger that lives in the bones of a species that has been fighting for survival since before it could walk upright. Humanity had crawled out of the mud of a world that tried to kill them every single day. They had survived ice ages that buried entire continents under glaciers a mile thick. They had survived plagues that killed 1 out of every 3 people alive. They had survived predators with claws and teeth and venom and speed and strength that should have wiped their soft and slow and clawless ancestors off the face of the planet. They had survived each other, which was perhaps the most impressive feat of all given how creative they were at finding new ways to fight. And every single time the universe had told humanity to lie down and die, humanity had looked the universe in the eye and said no. The Rethan did not know this. The Concordance did not know this. Nobody had bothered to study human history because nobody thought it mattered. That was the mistake that was going to cost them everything. In Luna Command, Admiral Rao activated a protocol that did not exist in any computer system anywhere in human space. It was called Prometheus. It had been created 70 years ago when humanity first made contact with the galactic community and realized very quickly that the galaxy was not a kind or fair place. The first generation of human leaders who dealt with the Concordance had come home from those early diplomatic missions with the same conclusion. The galaxy would exploit humanity the moment it was convenient, and no treaty or agreement or promise would protect them when that moment came. So they built Prometheus in secret. Not in databases or digital networks, because those could be hacked and monitored, and the Concordance had the technology to break any encryption humanity could devise. They built it in the oldest and most secure information storage system their species had ever created. Human memory. Prometheus was passed from commander to commander by word of mouth, face to face, in rooms with no recording devices, and each commander memorized it completely and passed it on to the next. It was a complete war doctrine. It contained the locations of hidden weapons platforms scattered across the solar system, disguised as asteroids and dead satellites and space debris. It contained the true specifications of Earth's warships, which were nothing like what the Concordance believed them to be. It contained contingency plans for 17 different invasion scenarios, ranked by fleet size and species capability. And it contained the authorization codes for weapons that the Concordance had banned 100,000 years ago because they were simply too destructive to exist. Admiral Rao had memorized all of it. She stood in the center of Luna Command, and she spoke without notes and without hesitation, and the officers around her listened with wide eyes as they learned for the first time what their species had really been building all these decades. "Our ships do not have energy shields," Rao said, "because we never needed them. Our armor is layered composite plating over reactive mesh that deforms on impact and redistributes kinetic energy across the entire hull. It was designed to take hits that would vaporize a shielded vessel because shields fail and armor does not." She pulled up a schematic that had never been shown to anyone below the rank of Fleet Admiral. "Our weapons are not energy lances because energy lances are elegant and precise, and we did not build our arsenal to be elegant. We built it to be devastating." The schematic showed the true armament of an Earth warship. Kinetic kill vehicles that could accelerate tungsten rods to a fraction of the speed of light. Nuclear-pumped X-ray lasers that could cut through the hull of a capital ship like a hot wire through butter. Electromagnetic mass drivers that fired streams of hypervelocity projectiles in patterns designed to overwhelm point defense systems. And something listed simply as Kasaba howitzer that made several officers in the room go very pale when they read the specifications. "The Concordance banned weapons like these because they considered them barbaric," Rao said. "They were right, they are barbaric, and today that is exactly what we need." Across the planet, the mobilization was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Concordant species took weeks or months to mobilize for military action, because their societies were built on order and process and careful deliberation. Humanity mobilized in hours. Factories that had been producing civilian goods switched to military production with a speed that should have been impossible, but was in fact the result of decades of quiet preparation. Every major manufacturing facility on Earth had been built with dual-use capability from the beginning. The assembly line that made agricultural equipment in the morning was producing missile components by evening. The shipyard that repaired commercial freighters at dawn was fitting weapon mounts by dusk. And the people came forward, not because they were ordered to, though the orders did come, but because something deep and primal and unstoppable had woken up inside the human species. Retired soldiers reported to their old units without being called. Engineers showed up at military facilities and asked where they were needed. Civilians with no military training at all walked into recruitment centers and said, "Tell me what to do." A Concordance observer stationed on Earth's moon watched the mobilization data streaming across her screens and felt something she had never felt before in her 200 years of life. She felt afraid. She opened a channel to the Concordance Monitoring Authority and said, "You need to see this. Something is happening down there. They are not surrendering. They are not panicking. I do not know what they are doing, but it is not anything in our behavioral models, and I think we may have made a very serious error in how we classified this species." Her report was filed and flagged for review in 6 to 8 standard cycles. By then it would be far too late. On the burning throne, Warlord Seathrak watched the deadline expire and felt the first small seed of irritation take root in his chest. No surrender. Not even a request for negotiation. Just silence. "Open a channel," he ordered. "Demand their response." The communication officer obeyed, and a moment later the main view screen flickered to life and Seathrak found himself looking at a human female in a dark uniform, standing on what appeared to be a military command deck. She was small by Rethan standards, barely half his height. With dark skin and dark hair pulled back tight and eyes that looked at him with an expression he did not recognize. He had seen fear in the eyes of the species he had conquered. He had seen despair and grief and broken resignation. This human looked at him the way A predator looks at something that has just made the mistake of wandering into its territory. "I am Warlord Seathrak of the Rethan Dominion," he said. "Your deadline has passed and I have received no response. I will ask once more, do you surrender?" The human female tilted her head slightly, and there was something in that small motion that made Drethak shift uncomfortably beside his warlord. "My name is Admiral Vasanta Rao," she said, "United Earth Defense Fleet." She paused, and the silence stretched between two species separated by the void of space, and by something much larger that Seathrak was only just beginning to sense. "We decline," she said. And then the screen went dark. Seathrak stared at the blank view screen for a long moment. "Warlord," Drethak said carefully, "what are your orders?" Seathrak bared his teeth. "Advance the fleet," he said. "Full combat formation. We will teach these creatures what happens to prey that forgets its place." He gave the order with absolute confidence. He could not have known that he had just made the worst decision in the recorded history of the galaxy. But he was about to find out. The Rethan fleet moved inward through the Sol system in a formation that had crushed 11 civilizations before this one. 12,000 warships arranged in a perfect crescent, each one bristling with energy lances and shielded by overlapping defensive fields that could absorb the combined firepower of most galactic navies without a scratch. Warlord Seathrak stood at the center of his command deck and watched the tactical display as his fleet crossed the orbit of Neptune and continued its steady advance toward the small blue world at the heart of this unremarkable system. His sensors showed no enemy fleet moving to intercept, no defensive formations, no orbital platforms powering up, just empty space and silence and the distant glow of a yellow star. "They are hiding," Drethak said with a note of contempt in his voice. "Cowering on their world and hopping, we show mercy." Seathrak said nothing. Something was bothering him, and he could not identify what it was. The silence felt wrong. It did not feel like the silence of a species that had given up. It felt like the silence of something waiting. But he pushed the thought aside because the mathematics were clear, and the mathematics did not lie, and 12,000 warships against 300 was not a battle. It was an execution. His fleet entered the Kuiper Belt, and the Kuiper Belt woke up. The first explosion came from an asteroid that had been drifting through the outer solar system for what appeared to be millions of years. It was not an asteroid. It was a weapons platform wrapped in rock and ice and coated with materials that absorbed every scanning frequency the Rethan possessed. And it had been sitting there in the cold and the dark for over 30 years waiting for exactly this moment. It fired a spread of 12 kinetic kill vehicles, tungsten rods accelerated to 4% of the speed of light by magnetic rail systems that drew power from a compact fusion core buried in the asteroid's center. The rods crossed the distance to the nearest Rethan warship in less than 2 seconds. They hit the ship's energy shields and went through them the way a bullet goes through paper, because energy shields were designed to disperse energy weapon fire, and they had no effective response to a solid object moving at 12,000 kilometers per second. The warship simply ceased to exist. It did not explode in the dramatic way that ships in galactic warfare usually did, with cascading shield failures and venting atmosphere and slowly expanding fireballs. It was there and then it was not there, and in its place was a cloud of superheated debris moving outward at tremendous speed and shredding the 2 ships on either side of it. 3 ships dead in 2 seconds from a single platform. And there were thousands of platforms. The Kuiper Belt erupted in a storm of kinetic fire that turned the outer solar system into a killing field. Rods of tungsten and depleted uranium screamed out of rocks and ice chunks and frozen debris in every direction, and the Rethan fleet flew straight into it at full speed, because they had never encountered anything like this, and their tactical doctrine had no response prepared. Ships died by the dozens, and then by the hundreds. Shields flared and failed, and hulls crumpled in atmosphere, vented into the vacuum in white plumes that froze instantly into clouds of crystal. Seathrak gripped the railing of his command deck and watched his tactical display light up with damage reports faster than his officers could process them. "What is this?" he demanded. "Where is the fire coming from?" "Everywhere, Warlord," his sensor officer said with a voice that was losing its composure. "The asteroids, the debris, the ice bodies, they are all weapons. There are thousands of them and we cannot target them fast enough." "Then accelerate through it," Seathrak ordered. "Maximum speed, push past the belt and regroup in open space." The fleet surged forward and it cost them. By the time the surviving ships cleared the Kuiper belt and entered the open space beyond Neptune's orbit, Seathrak had lost over 1,000 warships without ever seeing an enemy vessel. He stood in silence and looked at the tactical display, and for the first time in his long and bloody career, felt the cold touch of something he had never experienced before. Doubt. But there was no time for doubt, because the human fleet had finally appeared. They came out of the shadow of Mars, in formations that no galactic species had ever used, because no galactic species fought the way humans fought. There were no orderly battle lines, no ritual positioning, no broadcast declarations of intent or formal challenges. The human ships came in fast and low and scattered, using the gravitational fields of Mars and its moons as cover, and they hit the Rethan fleet from 6 directions at once. Admiral Rao commanded from the bridge of the UES Defiance, a heavy cruiser that was ugly and angular and looked like it had been designed by someone who cared about function and nothing else. Because it had been. "All ships weapons free," Rao said calmly. "Execute Gauntlet." Gauntlet was not a formation. It was a philosophy. Hit them from every angle. Never stay in one place. Never engage in a straight fight. Use speed and deception and the willingness to take insane risks to keep the enemy off balance and afraid. The human ships darted through the Rethan formation like wolves among cattle, firing kinetic salvos and missile spreads, and then burning hard to change course before the Rethan could lock on with their energy lances. The Rethan were better armed and better shielded, and they outnumbered the humans by a factor of more than 30-1. But they had never fought anyone like this. Every species the Rethan had conquered had fought in ways that the Rethan understood. Ordered formations, predictable tactics, a clear chain of command that could be identified and targeted and broken. Humans fought like chaos given purpose. A human destroyer would charge directly at a Rethan battleship, absorb hits that should have destroyed it because its armor held in ways that energy shields never could, fire a full kinetic broadside at point-blank range, and then roll away into the debris field of its own kills to reload. When human ships were crippled beyond the ability to fight, they did not surrender, and they did not withdraw. They rammed. The first time a dying human frigate accelerated to full speed and drove itself directly into the hull of a Rethan cruiser, Drethak stared at the explosion in disbelief. "They are insane," he whispered. "No," Seathrak said quietly, and his voice had changed. The contempt was gone and something older and darker had taken its place. "They are not insane, they are willing to die. There is a difference, and it is the most dangerous difference in the universe." The battle raged for hours in the space between Mars and Earth. Human ships died. There was no avoiding that. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and every ship they lost was a wound that could not be healed. But the Rethan bled too. They bled badly. For every human ship that fell, 3 or 4 or sometimes 5 Rethan ships went with it because humans did not sell their lives cheaply, and they did not go quietly into the dark. Rao moved her fleet with a ruthless efficiency that bordered on artistry, pulling damaged ships back and cycling fresh ones forward, using the debris of destroyed vessels as cover and as improvised kinetic weapons, exploiting every advantage that the solar system's geography offered. And then the Rethan pushed through the Mars corridor and entered Earth's inner defensive perimeter, and Rao played her next card. The space around Earth was full of junk. Old satellites and spent rocket stages and decommissioned stations, and all the accumulated debris of 2 centuries of human spaceflight. Except much of it was not junk. Hundreds of orbital defense platforms hidden inside dead satellites and hollow debris shells powered up simultaneously and opened fire with nuclear-pumped X-ray lasers that turned the space within 200,000 kilometers of Earth into a web of invisible death. Rethan ships that entered the perimeter were hit from angles they could not predict by weapons they could not see housed in objects they had dismissed as garbage. The killing was extraordinary. Seathrek watched his fleet die around him and felt something crack inside his chest. He had lost over 9,000 ships. 9,000. It was the worst single military defeat in the recorded history of the galaxy, and it had been inflicted by a species that the Concordance classified as irrelevant. He pulled his surviving ships back beyond the orbit of Mars and opened a channel to the Rethan homeworld with hands that were not entirely steady. "Send everything," he said. "Every ship, every reserve, every vessel that can carry a weapon, send it all. I want this world turned to ash. I want this species erased from existence. I want their name forgotten." He closed the channel and stood in the silence of his shattered command deck and looked at the distant blue dot that had just humiliated the most feared military power in the galaxy. On the bridge of the Defiance, Admiral Rao sat down for the first time in 14 hours. Her fleet had been cut in half. 147 ships remained from the 300 she had started with. But Earth was still there, battered and scarred, and surrounded by the wreckage of the greatest battle humanity had ever fought, but still there. Captain Yebo brought her a cup of coffee, and she took it with hands that were steady even though they should not have been. "They will come back," Yebo said. "Yes," Rao said. "With more?" "Yes." "How many more?" Rao took a sip of the coffee and looked at the tactical display where the retreating Rethan fleet was regrouping, and she thought about what was coming and what she would have to do when it arrived. "All of them," she said. And far away in the chambers of the Galactic Concordance, the battle data from Sol was being projected on the great crystal dome for every representative of every civilization to see. 4,000 species watched in absolute silence as a world they had dismissed as meaningless killed 9,000 warships in a single engagement. And several of them, the old ones, the ones who remembered what it was like when the galaxy was young and dangerous and full of hungry things in the dark, felt a sensation they had not felt in a very long time. They felt the hair rise on whatever equivalent of a neck their biology had given them. And they wondered what exactly they had been sharing the galaxy with all this time. The Rethan Dominion had never committed its full military to a single campaign. There had never been a reason to. A fraction of their fleet had always been enough to break whatever stood in front of them, and the rest remained spread across their conquered territories to maintain control over the enslaved populations that fueled their empire. But Warlord Seathrak's transmission changed everything. When the War Council on Seathra Prime received the battle data from Sol, they did not believe it at first. They ran the numbers again, and then a third time because the numbers could not possibly be correct. 9,000 warships destroyed by a species with 300 ships and some rocks. It was impossible. And yet the numbers did not change, no matter how many times they were calculated. The supreme commander of the Rethan Dominion, an ancient and massive creature named Varrock, who had built the Dominion's military into what it was over the last 2 centuries, watched the battle recordings with all 4 of his eyes and said nothing for a very long time. Then he gave the order. Every ship, every reserve, every patrol vessel pulled from every occupied territory, every half-built warship dragged out of the construction yards and fitted with whatever weapons could be mounted in time. 80,000 warships. It was the largest fleet ever assembled by a single species in galactic history, and it had one purpose: the complete and total annihilation of Earth and every human being alive. Varrock did not care about conquest anymore. He did not care about labor quotas or resource extraction or territorial expansion. A species that could do what humanity had just done could not be allowed to exist. They were too dangerous. They were too unpredictable. They were too willing to fight and too good at it. And if they were given time to grow and build and spread, they would become something that even the Rethan could not stop. So they had to die. All of them. Now, the fleet began its transit to Sol, and the galaxy watched it move with a kind of horrified fascination. In the Concordance chamber, Ambassador Okonkwo had not slept in 3 days. He had spent every hour of those 3 days in meetings and back channels and private conversations with representatives from dozens of species, pleading for support that everyone knew was not coming. The elder species would not intervene. They had made that clear through 1,000 small refusals and bureaucratic redirections and expressions of diplomatic concern that meant absolutely nothing. But something was happening among the younger species. The smaller civilizations that sat at the bottom of the Concordance hierarchy, the ones who had been quietly exploited and marginalized, and told to be grateful for the privilege of existing under the protection of their betters. They were watching Earth. They were watching a species, even smaller and weaker than themselves, stand up against the Rethan dominion and refuse to break. And something was stirring in them that the Concordance had spent 200,000 years trying to suppress. Hope. Okonkwo saw it in their eyes during the private meetings. He saw it in the way they leaned forward when he spoke. He saw it in the quiet nods and the whispered words of encouragement that they could not say publicly because the elder species would punish them for it. And he knew that whatever happened next, whether Earth survived or not, something had already changed in the galaxy that could not be unchanged. On the day the Rethan Armada was projected to arrive at Sol, Okonkwo requested the floor of the Concordance chamber one final time. The Velasi moderator granted it, perhaps out of curiosity or perhaps because even the moderator could feel the weight of what was happening and wanted to hear what the human would say. Okonkwo walked to the center of the chamber and looked up at 4,000 species arranged in rings above him, and he spoke. He did not plead. He did not beg. He told them about Earth. He told them about the ice ages and the plagues and the wars and the famines and the earthquakes and the floods and the fires and every single catastrophe that should have killed humanity and did not. He told them about the first human who picked up a rock and used it as a tool, and about the first human who looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there, and about the first human who built a ship and sailed across an ocean without knowing if there was anything on the other side. He told them about the concentration camps and the atomic bombs and the genocides, about the worst things humanity had ever done to itself, and about how they had looked at those horrors and decided to be better, not because they were naturally good, but because they chose to be, again and again, in the face of every reason not to. And then he said this: "We did not come to the stars to kneel." His voice was steady, and it carried through the chamber like a bell. "If we burn, we will burn so brightly that this galaxy will never forget the light." He looked around the chamber one more time at all those alien faces, some sympathetic, some indifferent, some afraid. Then he walked out, and he did not look back. Behind him, the chamber erupted into chaos. 12 species formally requested emergency debate on Concordance intervention. The elder species blocked the motion. 6 of the 12 species walked out of the chamber in protest. It was the first time in 40,000 years that any species had voluntarily left a Concordance session. The cracks were spreading. On Earth, Admiral Rao stood in Luna Command and looked at the projected numbers on the main display and did the math that she had been avoiding for 3 days. 147 ships against 80,000. The defense platforms were mostly spent. The Kuiper belt weapons had been revealed, and the Rethin would not fall for them twice. There was no conventional military strategy in the history of any species that could overcome those odds. So Rao turned to the unconventional. She opened a vault that existed only in her memory, the deepest and darkest layer of Protocol Prometheus, the part that every commander who had carried it hoped would never need to be used. It was called Operation Fenrir, named after the great wolf of Norse mythology that was destined to swallow the sun. Fenrir was not a battle plan. It was a doomsday weapon. Deep in the outer reaches of the solar system, hidden in locations that not even the Kuiper belt platforms had known about, there were 12 pods. Each pod contained a self-replicating kinetic swarm, a weaponized von Neumann machine that could consume raw material from asteroids and debris, and use it to build copies of itself, each copy armed with a relativistic drive that could accelerate it to 80% of the speed of light. Once launched and aimed at a target system, the swarm would travel through hidden FTL corridors that humanity had mapped in secret over the last 40 years. Corridors that no other species knew existed because humans had found them by accident and kept them to themselves. When the swarm arrived at its target, it would multiply and accelerate and fill the sky with 1,000,000 kinetic impacts, each carrying the energy of a nuclear weapon. It would not just destroy a fleet. It would not just destroy a world. It would sterilize an entire star system, and the debris from the impacts would travel outward and destabilize neighboring systems for centuries. It was the most terrible weapon ever conceived by any species in the history of the galaxy. And it had been designed by a species that had invented the atomic bomb and then spent the next 2 centuries staring at it and thinking about how to make something worse. Rao briefed her senior staff in a room with no windows and no recording devices. When she finished explaining what Fenrir was and what it would do, the room was silent for a long time. Captain Yebo was the first to speak. If we launch this at the Rethin homeworld, it will not just destroy them. The cascading effects could reach neighboring systems. We could be talking about billions of casualties across multiple species. I know, Rao said. This is a genocide weapon. I know what it is. Admiral, if we use this, we become the very thing the galaxy is afraid we are. Rao looked at him, and her face was the face of a woman who had not slept in days, and who was carrying a weight that no human being should ever have to carry. If we do not use it, she said quietly, there will be no more humans left to be anything at all. The room was silent again. I am not going to launch it, Rao said. Not unless there is no other choice, but I am going to arm it and I am going to aim it, and I am going to make very sure that Cthrak knows it exists and what it will do. Because sometimes the only way to stop a war is to make the cost of winning it higher than anyone is willing to pay. She gave the order. The 12 pods activated in the darkness of the outer solar system, and their targeting systems locked onto the Rethin homeworld. And then the Rethin Armada dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Sol system. 80,000 warships. The largest fleet ever assembled. Enough firepower to crack a planet in half. Rao stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked at the tactical display, and the display was so full of red contacts that it looked like the screen was bleeding. She put her hand on the Fenrir activation panel, and then a transmission cut through every channel in the system. It came from the Galactic Concordance High Council, the ruling body that had ignored humanity for 60 years, and it said 5 words. We are watching, proceed carefully. It was not help. It was not intervention. It was a warning aimed at both sides. But it meant that whatever happened next, the galaxy would see it, and the galaxy would remember it. Rao looked at the message and then looked at the 80,000 ships on her display, and then looked down at her hand, resting on the panel that could end a civilization. She took a breath. All ships, she said, battle stations. And across what remained of humanity's fleet, 147 crews prepared to fight 80,000. And every single one of them knew the odds. And not one of them flinched. The Second Battle of Saul began at 1400 hours Earth, Standard Time on a Thursday afternoon. It began badly. 80,000 Rethan warships advanced in a formation so vast that it blotted out the stars behind it, and the 147 remaining ships of the United Earth Defense Fleet moved to meet them like a handful of sparks thrown against an avalanche. Admiral Rao did not waste her ships in a head-on engagement because that would have been suicide, and she was not interested in dying. She was interested in winning. She split her fleet into 12 wolf packs of roughly 12 ships each and sent them screaming into the flanks of the Rethan formation at maximum speed, firing everything they had, and then burning hard to escape before the Rethan could concentrate fire. It was like throwing knives at a tidal wave. The wolf packs carved lines of destruction through the Rethan flanks and killed dozens of enemy ships in each pass. But there were 80,000 ships, and dozens meant nothing against those numbers. Sithrek had learned from the first battle. His fleet did not break formation, and did not pursue the human wolf packs into the debris fields where they could set ambushes. Instead, the Rethan armada maintained its advance toward Earth with the relentless patience of a glacier, and let the sheer weight of numbers do the work. Human ships began to die. The UES Constellation was hit by concentrated lance fire from 6 Rethan cruisers simultaneously, and broke apart in a flash of white light. The UES Iron Mountain took a direct hit to its reactor, and detonated with enough force to destroy 2 Rethan ships nearby, and there were those who said the captain had aimed the explosion deliberately in his final seconds. The UES Nairobi, the UES Chennai, the UES Sao Paulo, one after another the ships of Earth's fleet were hammered and broken and burned. And still they fought. They fought with a fury that the Rethan had never encountered in all their centuries of conquest, a fury that was not born of hatred or bloodlust, but of something deeper, something that lived in the marrow of a species that had never once in its entire history accepted that it was beat. But fury was not enough. Not against 80,000 ships. The Rethan armada pushed past the broken remnants of Earth's fleet and entered the inner system, and their forward elements began orbital bombardment of the planet below. The first strikes hit military targets, the remains of the orbital defense network, the fleet bases, the communication arrays. Then Sithrak gave the order to begin hitting cities. The first kinetic bombardment struck the outskirts of Jakarta. The impact was visible from space, a flash of light and a plume of dust and debris that rose into the upper atmosphere, and in the seconds after the strike 2 million people were dead. The second strike hit the coast of Brazil. The third hit southern Europe. On the bridge of the Defiance, Captain Yebo reported each impact with a voice that was cracking under the weight of what he was saying. Jakarta confirmed hit, casualties in the millions. Sao Paulo Basin confirmed hit, Mediterranean coast confirmed hit. Admiral, they are targeting population centers. Rao stood at the center of her bridge and watched her world begin to burn, and something shifted in her eyes. It was not rage. It was not despair. It was the cold and absolute clarity of a human being who has been pushed past every limit and come out the other side into a place where there is no more hesitation and no more doubt. She opened the Fenrir activation panel. All Fenrir pods confirmed targeting lock on Sithra Prime. 12 voices responded from 12 hidden locations in the outer solar system. Targeting lock confirmed. Launch. The word was quiet. It was the quietest word she had ever spoken, and it was the loudest thing that had ever happened in the history of the galaxy. 12 pods erupted from their hiding places, and their payload streaked outward, accelerating toward the hidden FTL corridors that would carry them to the Rethan homeworld at 80% of the speed of light. Each payload carried a self-replicating swarm that would multiply 1,000-fold during transit. By the time they arrived at Sithra Prime, there would be no defense that could stop them. The Rethan homeworld would die. Its moons would die. Its orbital stations and its shipyards and its colonies on the neighboring planets would die. and the debris from the impacts would spread outward into the surrounding systems and carry destruction for light years in every direction. It was the most terrible thing any species had ever done, and Rao had done it to save her own. She opened a channel to the Rethan flagship. Seathrak's face appeared on the screen, and he was smiling because he thought he was winning. "Admiral," he said, "I see your world is burning. Have you called to surrender at last?" "No," Rao said. "I have called to inform you that approximately 47 minutes ago, I launched a relativistic kinetic swarm at your homeworld." Seathrak's smile did not fade. It froze. "The swarm will arrive at Seathra Prime in approximately 6 hours, Rao continued. "Upon arrival, it will self-replicate and execute a saturation kinetic bombardment that will render your world and everything within 2 light years of it permanently uninhabitable." Seathrak stared at her. "You are lying," he said. "I am not. No species would destroy a world. The Concordance would." "The Concordance is watching," Rao said. "They sent us a message that said proceed carefully, so I am proceeding carefully." She let the silence hang for a moment. "I have the kill codes that will deactivate the swarm. I am prepared to transmit them, but my terms are not negotiable." Seathrak's face had gone the color of old ash. "What terms?" "Full and unconditional surrender of the Rethan Dominion, immediate cessation of all hostilities, withdrawal of all Rethan military forces to your home system, release of every enslaved species in Dominion territory, complete dismantlement of your offensive military capability, and a public declaration before the Galactic Concordance confessing every atrocity the Dominion has committed against every species you have conquered." "You cannot ask this." "I am not asking. This would destroy us, not our world, our civilization, everything we have built. You built it on the bones of 11 species who did not have the means to stop you," Rao said. "I have the means. The question is whether you would like to survive the experience. You have 5 minutes to decide." Seathrak looked at her through the screen, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be on the other side. To be the one without power. To be the one waiting for someone else to decide whether his people would live or die. The silence lasted 4 minutes and 38 seconds. "I accept your terms," Seathrak said. His voice was barely a whisper. "All Rethan forces ceasefire immediately." Rao nodded. "Fenrir control, transmit kill codes, authorization Rao 77 Prometheus." 12 minutes from the Rethan homeworld, the swarm received the signal and went dark. 12 minutes. That was how close it had been. In the Concordance chamber, the transmission had been broadcast on every screen, and every speaker and 4,000 civilizations had watched a human female stare down the most powerful warlord in the galaxy and make him blink. The silence in the chamber lasted a very long time. Then the representative of the Thessari, a small and quiet species that had been a Concordance member for 60,000 years and had never once spoken on the chamber floor, stood up from her seat and began to applaud. It was a human gesture. She had learned it from watching Earth's cultural broadcasts. One by one, other representatives stood. The younger species first, the small ones, the ones who had been told to sit down and be quiet for millennia. Then some of the mid-tier civilizations. Then slowly and reluctantly, a few of the elder species. Not all of them, but enough. The Concordance offered Earth a full voting seat on the Council within the week. Okonkwo accepted, but not before he placed a document on the moderator's desk that he had been writing for 3 sleepless days. It was called the Terra Accords. It proposed a complete reformation of Concordance law to extend protection to every spacefaring species, regardless of membership status. It proposed the creation of an independent military force answerable to the full Council, not just the elder species. It proposed that no species should ever again be told that its suffering was outside the scope of collective concern. The Velisi moderator read the document and looked at Okonkwo with all 6 of her eyes. This would change everything, she said. Yes, Okonkwo said, that is the point. The Terra Accords were ratified 4 months later, with the support of over 3,000 species. The Rethan Dominion was dismantled. The enslaved species were freed. Seathrak was brought before the concordance and made to speak the names of every species his people had destroyed and every atrocity they had committed, and the recitation took 9 hours. The galaxy was not the same after that. It could never be the same, because now everyone knew what lived on that little blue world in the Orion Spur. Not monsters, not conquerors, something far more unsettling. Survivors, a species that had been forged in the fire of the most hostile world in the galaxy, and had come out of it with the ability to be both the most compassionate and the most terrifying thing the universe had ever produced. And the choice between the two was always theirs to make. On the bridge of the Defiance, 3 weeks after the surrender, Admiral Rao stood at the viewport and looked down at Earth. The scars of the bombardment were still visible, dark patches on the surface where cities had been, brown smears where green should have been. But there were lights. In the darkness between the scars there were lights, millions of them, billions of them, the lights of a species that was already rebuilding, already healing, already looking up at the stars and wondering what came next. Captain Yebo walked up beside her and stood in silence for a while. "Do you think they will ever truly accept us?" he asked. "The galaxy, the concordance, all of them." Rao looked at the lights on the world below and thought about the question for a long time. Then she smiled, tired and sharp and full of something that was not quite pride and not quite sorrow, but something in between that only a human being could feel. "They do not have to accept us," she said. "They just have to remember what happens when they come for our home." Below them Earth turned slowly in the dark, scarred and battered and burning in places, but unbroken, always unbroken.